On a bustling Friday afternoon at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport in Washington state, the terminal thrummed with the restless energy of 1,000 intersecting lives. The air buzzed with sound. Overhead speakers crackled with flight updates, delivered in crisp, practiced English, occasionally laced with Spanish or Mandarin as travelers from distant corners of the world moved through the space. The sharp clack of suitcase wheels against polished marble floors blended with bursts of laughter, the insistent chirp of ringing phones, and the sporadic cries of overtired children clutching their parents' hands. Scents drifted through the crowd. Rich, dark coffee brewing at a nearby Starbucks, the sharp floral bite of high-end perfume, the greasy allure of fast food wafting from the food court, all undercut by the cool, recycled hum of industrial air conditioning. Above it all, massive digital boards loomed, their green and red letters flickering in a ceaseless rhythm, updating arrivals and departures like a heartbeat of global connection. At Gate C-14, where Pacific Sky Airlines Flight 412 to Atlanta was gearing up to board, a motley crowd of passengers assembled. Some sprawled across the rows of stiff vinyl seats, flipping through dog-eared paperbacks or swiping at their phones with glazed expressions. Others stood in loose clusters, shifting their weight from foot to foot, eyes darting toward the gate, counter as if willing the process to hurry along. Among them stood Michelle Carter, a poised black woman in her mid-40s, exuding a quiet authority softened by the faint weariness of a long week. She was dressed with understated elegance. A tailored, navy blazer hugged her frame, paired with a crisp white blouse and slim black trousers that tapered to her ankles. Her low-heeled pumps, practical yet polished, clicked softly as she adjusted her stance, and a sleek silver watch glinted on her wrist, her only jewelry aside from the rich burgundy leather briefcase resting by her feet. Michelle had just wrapped up a 3-day legal symposium in Seattle, a marathon of panels and debates that had left her intellectually charged but physically drained. Now she was headed home to Atlanta, craving the solace of her quiet condo after days of relentless engagement. To preserve that solitude, she traveled alone, eschewing the assistance or security detail her position might warrant. As she waited, near the front of the priority boarding line, she pulled out her tablet, her fingers skimming through case notes with the focus of someone who thrived under pressure. A few paces away, in the same priority line, stood Evelyn Thornton, a wealthy, white woman in her late 50s whose presence was as loud as Michelle's was subtle. Evelyn was a walking billboard of excess, draped head to toe in designer finery, a cream Chanel suit that screamed money, adorned with gold necklaces and bracelets that jangled with every impatient gesture. Her face, though expertly made up with foundation and a slash of red lipstick, was locked in a perpetual scowl. Her thin lips pursed as she checked the time on a diamond-encrusted Rolex and let out a theatrical huff. She radiated irritation, her sharp blue eyes raking over the crowd with a disdain that bordered on contempt. When those eyes landed on Michelle, they lingered, narrowing into a frown of visceral displeasure. In Evelyn's rigid, prejudiced mind, a black woman standing confidently in the priority line, poised to board business class, no less was an aberration, a glitch in the natural order she clung to. She muttered under her breath, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to catch the gist. Standards have really gone downhill. Anyone can get priority these days. Her companion, a harried assistant juggling an armful of Nordstrom shopping bags, nodded absently, too worn down by Evelyn's constant griping to muster a real response. Evelyn's simmering resentment didn't stay contained for long. With a dramatic flourish, she marched up to the gate agent's desk, her stiletto heels striking the floor like gunfire. Her voice, a blend of condescension and command, sliced through the ambient din. "Excuse me, miss," she began, leaning forward to loom over the young woman behind the counter, whose name tag read, "Katie. Why am I stuck waiting in this line with those people?" She jerked her chin toward Michelle, her tone dripping with venom. "Look at her just standing there, eyeing my bags like she's up to no good. I don't feel safe flying with someone like that. She's probably using fake credentials to sneak into business class. You need to check her papers now." Katie blinked, her cheeks flushing as she clutched her clipboard tighter. "Ma'am, everyone in this line has been verified for priority." "Boarding," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the crowd. "There's no issue here." Evelyn waved a manicured hand, her gold bracelets clinking dismissively. "I don't care what you think. Do your job and check her." "This is absurd." The exchange rippled through the gate area like a stone dropped in still water. Katie tried again, her words faltering under Evelyn's glare. "Our process ensures—" "Don't give me excuses," Evelyn snapped, her voice rising to a pitch that turned heads. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging raised eyebrows, others pretending not to notice as they buried their faces in their screens. For Michelle, standing silently a few feet away, the scene was impossible to ignore. She glanced up from her tablet, her dark eyes narrowing as Evelyn's words sank in. She recognized the playbook, had seen it too many times before, but she held her composure, her expression a mask of calm. She could have intervened, could have called out the baseless accusation right then, but she waited, assessing. Years of navigating hostility had taught her patience, and she sensed this was only the opening act. The real drama, she knew, was yet to unfold. Michelle Carter stood rooted in the priority line at gate C14, her tablet now resting against her hip as she watched Evelyn Thornton's outburst unfold with a mix of weariness and quiet resolve. At 45, she'd built a life confronting people like Evelyn, those who wore their privilege like a crown and wielded it like a cudgel. She'd turned their barbs into stepping stones, climbing from a modest upbringing in Atlanta to a career defined by grit and brilliance. Here in the fluorescent glare of an airport terminal, she'd hoped for a brief respite, a chance to board her flight and leave the battles behind for a few hours. But Evelyn had other ideas, and Michelle knew the script. All too well. Evelyn's voice climbed higher, sharp and grating as she berated the gate agent. "I'm telling you, she doesn't belong here," she insisted, jabbing a manicured finger toward Michelle. "Look at her standing there like she owns the place. She's been staring at my luggage this whole time, probably plotting something. Shady. I've flown business class for decades and I know who fits and who doesn't. You need to do something about this." Katie, the gate agent, fumbled with her clipboard, her eyes darting between Evelyn and Michelle like a deer caught in headlights. "Ma'am, I assure you, everyone in this line has a valid boarding pass," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's no problem here." But Evelyn wasn't in the mood for reason. She folded her arms, her gold bracelets clanking, and let out a huff that echoed with entitlement. "Don't give me that nonsense. I want her checked right now." The accusation landed like a slap, baseless and ugly, yet heavy with the weight of Evelyn's self-assured privilege. A few passengers nearby exchanged glances, some curious, some uncomfortable, while others shifted their weight, sensing the brewing storm. Michelle felt the familiar prick of being singled out, her presence distilled into a caricature in Evelyn's eyes. She took a slow, deliberate breath, her fingers tightening around her tablet. She could have spoken up then, could have dismantled the absurdity with a few choice words, but she'd learned to bide her time, to let the pieces fall before making her move. For now, she observed, her face impassive, as Evelyn's tantrum drew the attention of two airport police officers patrolling the concourse. Officer Mark Daniels, a grizzled man in his late 50s with a lined face and a perpetual squint, turned his head toward the commotion, his hand resting on his radio. His partner, Officer Ryan Kessler, a wiry 30-something with a buzz cut and a restless edge, followed suit, his fingers brushing the edge of his utility belt. Daniels had spent decades at SeaTac, his instincts sharpened by years of handling everything from lost bags to bar fights. But beneath his weathered exterior lurked a quiet bias, a filter he'd carried so long it felt like second nature, one that too often aligned with Evelyn's worldview. Kessler, newer to the force and hungry to prove himself, mirrored his partner's stance, though his aggression simmered closer to the surface, ready to boil over at the slightest provocation. Evelyn's eyes gleamed as she spotted the officers, sensing an ally in her crusade. She pivoted on her heel, her tone shifting from imperious to plaintive, though no less toxic. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she called, waving them over with a flourish. "You've got to help me. That woman over there," she pointed at Michelle again, her voice quivering with feigned distress. "She's making me so nervous. She keeps staring at me and my bags with these strange eyes. I don't feel safe getting on a plane with her. Please, you need to check her out thoroughly. We can't let people like that ruin our flight." She clasped her hands, playing the victim with a skill honed by years of manipulation, her words dripping with racial undertones designed to hook the officer's assumptions. Daniels cocked an eyebrow, his gaze sliding over to Michelle. He took in her polished look, the blazer, the briefcase, the steady posture, but his mind latched onto Evelyn's narrative instead. A well-dressed white woman in distress versus a black woman in a place she shouldn't be. It was a tale he'd seen play out too many times, one he'd internalized over decades on the beat. Kessler, meanwhile, cracked his knuckles, his lips twitching into a faint smirk. He didn't need much convincing. The chance to throw his weight around was all the invitation he required. Without a word to each other, the two officers straightened up and started toward Michelle, their steps measured but heavy, their presence radiating a quiet menace. The crowd at gate C-14 parted slightly as the officers approached, a ripple of unease spreading through the air. Passengers whispered to each other, some pulling out their phones to record discreetly, others watching with bated breath. Michelle set her tablet atop her briefcase, her shoulders squaring as she braced herself. She knew what was coming, had lived through versions of this moment, more times than she cared to count, but she refused to let it shake her. "Ma'am," Daniels began, his voice rough and tinged with a forced neutrality that didn't quite hide. His suspicion, "We need you to step out of line. We've got a few questions for you." Michelle met his eyes, her dark gaze steady and unflinching. She stepped forward calmly, her voice low but firm. "Officers, what's this about?" Daniels shifted his weight, glancing back at Evelyn, who stood with her arms crossed and a triumphant smirk curling her lips. "We've had a complaint," he said, his tone hardening. "Someone's concerned you might be a security risk. We're going to need to see your ID and boarding pass." Michelle arched an eyebrow, her lips pressing into a thin line. She reached into her briefcase, retrieving her driver's license and business-class boarding pass with deliberate care, and handed them over. "Here you are," she said evenly. "Everything's in order. Now can you tell me exactly what I'm being accused of? I've been standing here minding my own business just like everyone else." Kessler snorted, stepping closer, his impatience flaring. "Why all the questions? When we ask for something, you do it. That's how this works." Daniels, holding her documents, scanned them quickly. Michelle Carter, business class, then looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her attire. "How do you afford this ticket?" he muttered, his voice thick with insinuation. "What do you do for a living? You sure this is yours?" The words were a blunt jab, a racial and class slight laid bare, and for the first time a spark of anger flickered across Michelle's face. She straightened, her voice rising just enough to carry. "You're questioning me based on someone else's prejudice, not evidence. My ticket and my profession are none of your concern, unless you've got a legal reason to ask. I'm a U.S. citizen, a paying passenger, and I deserve respect. Your behavior is out of line." Her words landed like a thunderbolt, sharp and unyielding, slicing through the officer's smug certainty. Daniels flinched, unaccustomed to pushback, while Kessler's face flushed, his fists clenching. Evelyn watched from the sidelines, her smirk widening. The stage was set and the tension was about to erupt. The atmosphere at gate C-14 thickened with a palpable strain as Michelle Carter stood firm, her voice cutting through the hum of the terminal with a clarity that silenced the scattered whispers around her. Officer Mark Daniels and Officer Ryan. Kessler, momentarily thrown by her unyielding response, exchanged a fleeting glance, Daniels' eyes narrowing into slits, Kessler's jaw clenching tight. They weren't accustomed to this kind of resistance. In their world, authority demanded compliance, especially from someone they'd already pegged as out of place. Michelle's refusal to cower under their scrutiny struck a nerve, igniting a volatile mix of anger and bruised ego that propelled them into their next move. Daniel stepped closer, his weathered face twisting into a scowl that deepened the lines etched by years of unchallenged power. "You don't get to decide what's out of line," he snapped, jabbing a thick finger toward her chest. "We're the law here, and we say what's suspicious. You're making this harder than it needs to be, lady." Kessler, feeding off, his partner's aggression, edged in beside him, his voice rising with a raw edge. "Who do you think you are, huh? Talking back like that, you're just begging for trouble." His tone dripped with menace, his body language a coiled spring, shoulders squared, chest puffed out, a predator testing the limits of his prey. Michelle didn't budge. She'd faced down worse than this, courtrooms packed with hostile stares, systems rigged to silence her, and she'd honed her composure into an impenetrable shield. At 45, she knew how to stand tall when others expected her to shrink. "I'm asking for your badge numbers," she said, her voice steady as granite. "And I want to know the specific basis for this stop. You're harassing me without cause, and that's a violation of my rights under the law." Her words were deliberate, razor-sharp, laced with the authority of someone who understood the rules better than they ever would. But to Daniels and Kessler, her knowledge wasn't a defense, it was a challenge. Her confidence a personal affront they couldn't tolerate. The officer's thin veneer of restraint, if it could even be called that, shattered. "You think you're smart, huh?" Kessler bellowed, his face now inches from hers, his breath hot and sour as he shouted. "Some wannabe lawyer trying to play games? We've got every right to do this." Spit flecked from his lips, his eyes wild with fury. Daniels piled on, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl. "You're nothing but trouble, uppity and out of line. You want to talk rights? How about we make sure you don't see that flight or anything else tonight?" The racial undertone wasn't subtle. It was a blade, thrust deep and twisted, meant to strip her down in front of the gawking crowd. The gate area fell into a stunned hush, the ambient noise of the airport fading as passengers froze, their eyes locked on the unfolding scene. Some clutched their phones tighter, fingers trembling as they recorded. Others stood slack-jawed, caught between disbelief and fear. The gate agent, Katie, took a tentative step forward, her voice quavering. "Officers, maybe we can just—" Daniels cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand, his gaze never leaving Michelle. "Stay out of this," he barked, his tone brooking no argument. Evelyn Thornton, watching from a few feet away, folded her arms tighter, her lips curling into a satisfied sneer. She'd lit the fuse, and now the explosion was everything she'd hoped for. Michelle's heart thudded in her chest, not from fear, but from a righteous anger she kept tightly reined. She drew a slow, deep breath, her eyes flicking between the two men towering over her. "You're crossing a line you'll regret," she warned, her voice low but resonant, carrying a weight that made a few onlookers lean closer. "This isn't about safety, it's about your bias and her lies." She tilted her head toward Evelyn, who bristled at the accusation but held her tongue, her smirk faltering for a split second. Daniels let out a harsh, grating laugh. "Regret? Let's see who regrets what. You're under arrest right now for disturbing the peace, resisting us, and threatening flight security." The charges were a flimsy patchwork of nonsense, shouted, with a conviction that relied on volume over substance, as if he could will them into legitimacy. Before Michelle could respond, Kessler sprang into action, his movements swift and brutal. He lunged forward, seizing her arm with a grip so tight she winced, though she refused to give him the satisfaction of a cry. "Hands behind your back!" he roared, his voice bouncing off the terminal walls. She didn't resist, physically knew better than to hand them that ammunition, but her protests rang out clear and fierce. "You have no right to do this. Let go of me." Her words sliced through the tense silence, but Kessler ignored them, yanking, her arms back with a force that twisted her shoulders. The cold clank of metal echoed as he pulled handcuffs from his belt, snapping them onto her wrists with a deliberate roughness that made the steel bite into her skin. The pain was sharp, a stinging reminder of their intent, but she held her head high, her dignity a fortress they couldn't breach. The scene was surreal, a public unraveling that left the crowd reeling. Passengers gaped, some whispering in shock, others filming with shaky hands as Kessler shoved Michelle forward, forcing her to stumble slightly. Daniels stood back, arms crossed, a smug glint in his eyes as he muttered under his breath, "Should have known your place." Evelyn, still rooted to her spot, beamed with triumph, her earlier complaints now vindicated in her warped mind. The march began not toward the boarding gate, but through the crowded terminal toward the airport police station, a spectacle designed to crush Michelle's spirit. She kept her back straight, her steps measured, even as the cuffs dug deeper. They thought they'd broken her, reduced her to nothing. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and that ignorance was about to turn their world upside down. The journey through Seattle-Tacoma International Airport felt like a gauntlet, though Michelle Carter refused to let it shatter her. Officer Ryan Kessler's hand pressed hard against her back, shoving her forward with a force that bordered on cruelty, while Officer Mark Daniels trailed behind, his arms still crossed, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. The handcuffs chafed against her wrists, leaving raw red welts that throbbed with each step. But Michelle's expression remained a study in resolve, her dark eyes fixed straight ahead. She could feel the weight of hundreds of stairs passengers pausing mid-stride, airline staff peering over counters, random travelers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the drama. Some whispered to each other, their voices a low hum of speculation. Others held up phones, their screens glowing as they captured the injustice unfolding in real time. To them she was a curiosity, a fleeting headline, but to her this was a violation deliberate, personal and searing. The terminal stretched out before her like a vast, gleaming maze, glass walls, reflecting the chaos, polished floors echoing with the clatter of footsteps and overhead signs flashing destinations she'd never reached today. The speakers droned on, oblivious to the scene below. Flight 412 to Atlanta, boarding at gate C14 in 10 minutes. The irony stung. She should have been settling into her business-class seat, sipping water and unwinding, not paraded through the airport like a felon. Kessler's grip tightened as they passed a cluster of teenagers who stared wide-eyed before one snickered, earning a glare from Daniels that silenced them instantly. "Keep moving," Kessler growled, giving her another shove that made her stumble, though she caught herself with a grace that defied their efforts to degrade her. Evelyn Thornton had stayed behind at the gate, but her shadow loomed over every step of this ordeal. Michelle could still see her in her mind's eye, the smug tilt of her head, the gleam of victory in those sharp blue eyes. This was Evelyn's handiwork, her baseless accusations turned into a weapon by two officers too eager to flex their power. The thought stoked a slow burn of fury in Michelle's chest, but she channeled it into focus, her mind racing as she catalogued every detail, the officers' badge numbers glinting on their uniforms, Daniels 547, Kessler 819, the cadence of their insults, the precise wording of their fabricated charges. She wasn't just enduring this, she was preparing, building a case with every humiliating step. They reached the airport police station, a stark utilitarian office tucked behind a Starbucks kiosk near the baggage claim. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room with flickering fluorescent bulbs, a scratched metal desk, and a wall of grainy security monitors. A duty officer, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a bored slump, looked up from a stack of paperwork as Daniels and Kessler marched Michelle inside. "Got a troublemaker," Daniels announced, his voice thick with disdain as he jerked his thumb toward her. "Disturbing the peace, resisting threatening flight safety. Caught her at C14 causing a scene." Kessler shoved Michelle toward a chair, the cuffs rattling as she sat, her posture still erect despite the strain. "She's got an attitude problem," he added, smirking as he leaned against the desk. Thought she could talk her way out of it. The duty officer, his name tag read Sergeant Paulson, barely glanced at her, his fingers already tapping at a keyboard with the detachment of someone numb to the job's daily grind. "ID?" he asked, his tone flat. Daniels tossed Michelle's driver's license and boarding pass onto the desk with a flick of his wrist. "Michelle Carter," he sneered, dragging her name through the mud like it was a joke. "Business class claims it's legit." Paulson picked up the documents, squinting at them through smudged glasses, as he began entering her details into the system. Michelle sat silently, her hands still bound behind her, the metal cutting deeper with every subtle shift. She could feel the officer's eyes boring into her, their smugness a tangible weight, but she kept her breathing even, her mind razor-sharp. Paulson's questions came in a monotone, a rote checklist he'd run through 1,000 times. "Full name?" "Michelle Renee Carter," she replied, her voice clear and unwavering. "Age?" 45. "Address?" 1287 Peachtree Lane, Atlanta, Georgia. Each answer was a quiet act of defiance, a refusal to let them rattle her. Daniels leaned against the wall, muttering something to Kessler that drew a low chuckle, a crude jab about her fancy ticket, no doubt. Paulson paused, his fingers hovering over the keys, and asked the final question. Occupation? The room seemed to hold its breath, the hum of the monitors the only sound breaking. The silence. Michelle lifted her chin, her gaze locking onto Paulson's before sweeping over Daniels and Kessler, who stood smirking like they'd already won. She took a deep breath, her voice ringing with an authority that filled the cramped space, not loud, not shaken, but resolute and undeniable. I am Chief Judge Michelle Carter of the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. The words detonated like a grenade, obliterating the officer's arrogance in an instant. Paulson's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk as his jaw dropped, his eyes widening in disbelief. He stared at her, then at her ID, then back at her, his face paling as the realization sank in. A federal appeals court judge, one of the most powerful figures in the American judiciary, sat before him, handcuffed and humiliated by his own men. Daniels staggered back, his shoulder slamming into the wall with a dull thud, his eyes bulging with terror. Kessler froze, his smirk vanishing as his hands began to shake, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. They hadn't just stopped. A random passenger, they'd arrested a woman who could end their careers, their lives, with a single gavel strike. For a moment, no one moved. Then survival instinct kicked in. Daniels stammered, his voice a fractured mess. Chief Judge Carter? Oh God, we didn't know. We're so sorry, ma'am. This is a mistake. A horrible mistake. He lurched forward, his hands trembling. As he pleaded, Kessler dropped to his knees, tears welling in his eyes, his bravado replaced by desperation. Please, Judge, forgive us. We didn't mean it, we were just following a complaint. Please don't ruin us, I've got a family. Their voices overlapped in a pitiful chorus, but Michelle remained unmoved, her expression a wall of steel. She'd seen too many hollow apologies in her courtroom to be swayed by this display. The reckoning was here, and they'd brought it on themselves. The air inside the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport police station crackled with a tension so dense it seemed to press against the peeling paint on the walls. Sergeant Paulson's hands trembled as he gripped the phone, his voice faltering. As he dialed the numbers Chief Judge Michelle Carter had ordered him to call. Officer Mark Daniels slumped against the wall, his face drained of color, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead, despite the chill of the room. Officer Ryan Kessler remained on his knees, his earlier bravado reduced to a quivering heap, his eyes darting wildly as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. They'd gone from swaggering enforcers to broken men in the span of a single sentence, the weight of their colossal error crashing down like a tidal wave. Michelle sat in the chair, her wrists still stinging from the cuff's bite, but her posture was unbowed, regal even. She wasn't just a passenger now, she was a force of nature, and the room bent to her quiet, commanding presence. Paulson's first call connected to the airport police chief, Richard Holt, a no-nonsense man whose gruff voice cut through the line like gravel. "Holt here, what's the issue?" Paulson swallowed hard, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Sir, we've got a major problem. Officers Daniels and Kessler detained a woman at gate C14, handcuffed her, brought her here. She's Chief Judge Michelle Carter of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals." The line went dead silent for a heartbeat. Then Holt's voice erupted, a thunderclap of disbelief and fury. "You're telling me what? A federal judge? In cuffs? Are you people insane?" Paulson winced, pulling the phone away from his ear. As Holt continued, "I don't care how it happened, I'm coming down there now. Nobody moves an inch until I arrive. You hear me?" The call ended with a sharp click, leaving Paulson visibly shaken. The second call went to the U.S. Marshals Service, the federal agency charged with safeguarding judges like Michelle. The duty marshal, Carla Ruiz, answered with a clipped efficiency. "Ruiz, Marshal Service, what's your situation?" Paulson's voice cracked as he explained, barely finishing before Ruiz cut in, her tone icy and precise. "Let me get this. Straight, one of our judges is in custody at SeaTac. Who authorized this? I need names and badge numbers now." Paulson stammered out Daniels' 547 and Kessler's 8119, and Ruiz's response was swift. "We're mobilizing. I'll be there. In 20 minutes with a team. You keep her safe or you'll answer to me personally." The final call reached David Ellison, the chief clerk of the 11th Circuit, a meticulous man whose calm demeanor shattered as Paulson relayed the news. "A judge of our court," he said, his voice tight with shock. "I'm sending senior staff immediately. This is a disaster." In the station, Daniels and Kessler watched the calls unfold like condemned men awaiting a verdict. Daniels tried again, his voice a pitiful whine that grated against the silence. "Judge Carter, please, we didn't mean any disrespect. It was a misunderstanding, honest to God. We'll do anything to fix this." He took a shaky step forward, his hands outstretched in supplication. Kessler, still on the floor, clasped his hands together, tears streaming down his flushed cheeks. "Please, Judge, have mercy. We didn't know who you were. We were just following a complaint. I've got kids at home. Don't destroy us over this." Their pleas overlapped in a desperate, discordant symphony, but Michelle's gaze remained cold and unyielding. She'd spent her career dismantling such excuses, empty words from those who thought a badge or a sob story could erase their actions. "Your apologies don't undo what you've done," she said, her tone flat and final. "You'll face the consequences just like anyone else." Within 30 minutes, the station transformed into a chaotic nexus of authority. Chief Holt burst through the door, his broad frame filling the threshold, his face flushed with a mix of rage and panic. His deputy and the head of airport security trailed behind, their expressions grim. Moments later, Marshal Ruiz stormed in with 2 agents, their black jackets emblazoned with U.S. Marshals in bold white letters, exuding a federal gravitas that made Daniels and Kessler shrink further, into themselves. David Ellison arrived last, a briefcase clutched in his hand, his wire-rimmed glasses fogging slightly as he surveyed the scene with a look of controlled dismay. The cramped office, designed for petty thefts and lost IDs, now hosted a convergence of power that turned it into the epicenter of a crisis. Holt approached Michelle first, his head dipping in a gesture of deference. "Chief Judge Carter, I'm Richard Holt, head of SeaTac Police," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I can't apologize enough for this. What my officers did is beyond unacceptable. We'll get to the bottom of it, I give you my word." Michelle nodded, her tone measured but firm. "Thank you, Chief. Let's start with the facts." Assisted by Ellison, who opened his briefcase to produce a notepad, she recounted the incident with surgical precision. Evelyn Thornton's venomous provocation, Daniels and Kessler's biased intervention, the barrage of racial insults, and the unlawful arrest in front of hundreds. Her delivery was calm, methodical, each detail a brick in the wall of evidence building against the officers. Holt listened, his jaw tightening with every word, his fists clenching at his sides. When she finished, he turned to Daniels and Kessler, his voice a low guttural growl. "You two are suspended effective immediately. Turn in your badges, weapons, all of it. You're done here until we figure this out." He gestured to his deputy. "Get internal affairs on this and call the FBI. We're opening a full investigation, cameras, body cams, witness statements, everything." Daniels opened his mouth to protest, his voice feeble. "Chief, we were just—" "Save it," Holt snapped, cutting him off with a glare. "You've got nothing to stand on." Michelle watched, her expression unreadable, as the wheels of justice began to turn. The storm was just beginning, and she was at its center. The airport police station buzzed with frenetic energy as Chief Richard Holt took command, his voice barking orders with the urgency of a man racing to contain a wildfire. Officers scrambled to comply, phones rang incessantly, and the weight of Michelle Carter's presence loomed over every hurried movement. Mark Daniels and Ryan Kessler, now stripped of their badges and gear, sat in a corner like chastened children, their uniforms a hollow shell of the authority they'd once wielded. Daniels stared at the floor, his hands clasped tight to still their shaking, while Kessler rocked slightly, muttering incoherent apologies to the empty air. The arrival of U.S. Marshal Carla Ruiz and 11th Circuit Clerk David Ellison had raised the stakes to a federal level. There was no hiding from this now, no corner dark enough to escape the light of scrutiny. Holt convened an emergency meeting. In the station's tiny conference room, a space barely big enough for the folding table and mismatched chairs crammed inside. Michelle sat at one end, flanked by Ruiz and Ellison, her wrist still bearing faint red marks from the cuff's silent testament to the ordeal she'd endured. Holt stood opposite, his deputies and security chief crowding behind him like a nervous entourage. "Judge Carter," he began, his tone thick with contrition, "I've ordered a joint investigation with Internal Affairs and the FBI's Civil Rights Division. We're pulling everything security footage from Gate C-14, body cam data from Daniels and Kessler, statements from airline staff and witnesses. Nothing gets overlooked." Michelle nodded, her voice cool and unwavering. "Good. I expect full transparency, Chief. This wasn't a simple error, it was a deliberate violation of my rights and the law." The investigation launched with relentless speed. Technicians retrieved footage from the gate security cameras, capturing the incident in stark detail. Evelyn Thornton's shrill accusations, the officer's menacing approach, the moment. Kessler snapped the cuffs on Michelle's wrists as the crowd looked on in shock. Daniel's body cam recorded his muttered slurs, uppity, out of line. While Kessler's captured the rough arrest, his shouts and shoves laid bare for all to hear. Passengers who'd filmed on their phones stepped forward, their shaky, videos flooding social media with hashtags like SeaTac Injustice and Justice for Michelle, turning the story into a viral firestorm. Katie, the gate agent, provided a tearful statement, her voice breaking as she corroborated Michelle's account. "I saw it all," she said, wringing her hands. "She didn't do anything wrong. I should have stopped it, but I was scared." Evelyn Thornton was apprehended just as she reached the jet bridge, her boarding pass still in hand. Officers escorted her back to the terminal, her designer suit now wrinkled, her protests rising in pitch. "This is outrageous. I did nothing wrong. She was the problem," she screeched, her voice echoing through the concourse. But the evidence was damning: camera footage, witness accounts, even Daniels and Kessler's panicked admissions under pressure painted her as the instigator. Investigators sat her down in a holding room, grilling her on her false claims, her role in escalating the incident, and the racial venom that fueled her words. Faced with the prospect of felony charges, making false statements to law enforcement, inciting a civil rights violation, she faltered, her attorney rushing to negotiate a plea as her bravado crumbled. Holt returned to Michelle with an update, his face etched with exhaustion. "We've got enough to bury them," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Daniels and Kessler are looking at abuse of power, racial profiling, unlawful detention, the list goes on. Thornton's on the hook for slander and false reporting. She's terrified now, knows she's in over her head." Michelle listened, her expression a mask of steel. "I want the process followed meticulously, Chief," she said. "No shortcuts, no leniency. They need to face the full weight of their actions." Holt nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly under the burden. "You have my word, Judge. We're not letting this slide." The officers' fates were sealed that day. Holt finalized their termination papers. Daniels and Kessler were out, their careers reduced to rubble. But the legal consequences loomed larger still. The U.S. Attorney's Office, alerted by the marshals, took over, preparing federal charges that could land the pair behind bars. Evidence was sealed: camera data, body cam footage, witness statements, all locked down for the inevitable trial. As for Evelyn, investigators confirmed her identity and flight details. If she'd left, authorities in Atlanta would be waiting. Michelle watched the flurry of action unfold, her mind already turning to the broader implications. This wasn't just about her, it was a chance to expose the rot in systems she'd spent her life challenging. As the station began to clear, she stood, brushing off her blazer with a steady hand. The fight wasn't over, but the first battle had been won, and she was ready for what came next. The investigation into the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport incident moved with the precision and speed of a well-oiled machine, driven by the FBI's Civil Rights Division and SeaTac's Internal Affairs Unit. The evidence piled up like a fortress: hours of security footage, dozens of witness statements, and the unassailable testimony of Chief Judge Michelle Carter herself, delivered with the measured authority of a woman who'd spent decades weighing truth in the balance. The footage from Gate C-14 was a vivid chronicle of the ordeal. Evelyn Thornton's shrill, venomous accusations slicing through the crowd, officers Mark Daniels and Ryan Kessler striding forward with menace, and the jarring moment when Kessler snapped handcuffs onto Michelle's wrists as onlookers gasped in disbelief. Daniels's body cam captured his muttered slurs, uppity, should have known her place, while Kessler's recorded the rough shove and barked orders, his aggression laid bare in crackling audio. Passenger videos, uploaded by the dozens, turned the incident into a national lightning rod, trending under headlines like "Federal Judge Humiliated at SeaTac" and "Justice Denied at Gate C-14." The legal machinery roared to life. Daniels and Kessler faced a federal indictment from the U.S. Attorney's Office, violating civil rights under color of law, unlawful detention, and conspiracy to deprive a citizen of her constitutional protections. Their trial unfolded in Seattle's U.S. District Court, a sleek modern building that became a circus of media vans and protesters chanting for accountability. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Reporters scribbled furiously. Spectators craned their necks, and the air buzzed with anticipation. The prosecution built a case as solid as steel, with Michelle's testimony as its cornerstone. She took the stand in her navy blazer, her voice steady and resonant, recounting the ordeal with unflinching detail. Evelyn's provocation, the officer's racial taunts, the cold bite of the cuffs in front of hundreds. Her words carried the weight of her office, each sentence a hammer striking at the defendant's defense. The defense floundered, their arguments thin and desperate. Daniels's attorney claimed a misunderstanding, insisting his client had acted in good faith on a passenger's complaint. Kessler's lawyer leaned on his youth, painting him as a rookie misled by his senior partner. But the evidence was a tidal wave, video after video, witness after witness, all corroborating Michelle's account. The jury, a mix of Seattle locals from varied walks of life, deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the foreman's voice rang out, "Guilty on all counts." Daniels slumped in his chair, his face a mask of defeat, while Kessler buried his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The gallery erupted in murmurs, a ripple of satisfaction spreading through the room. Sentencing came a week later, presided over by Judge Harold Grayson, a stern veteran with a reputation for zero tolerance. He peered over his glasses at the defendants, his voice booming with gravitas. "You betrayed the public trust," he declared, his words echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Your actions weren't mere errors, they were malicious, rooted in bias, and directed at a federal officer of the court. You abused your power, endangered a citizen, and tarnished the badge you wore." He paused, letting the weight settle. "This court must send a message. Such conduct will not be tolerated." He sentenced Daniels and Kessler each to 4 years. In federal prison, a severe penalty under the guidelines, reflecting the gravity of targeting a judge. Some whispered it was harsh, but others saw it as a necessary deterrent, a line drawn in the sand against law enforcement overreach. Evelyn Thornton's reckoning was quieter, but no less punishing. Facing felony charges for making false statements to law enforcement and inciting a civil rights violation, she crumbled under the pressure. Her attorney, a slick Seattle litigator, negotiated a plea to avoid a trial that would have splashed her humiliation across every news outlet. She pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor providing false information and agreed to a $500,000 fine, a stinging blow to her wealth that left her visibly shaken. The prospect of a civil suit from Michelle loomed too, a shadow she couldn't escape. Once a picture of haughty privilege, Evelyn became a cautionary tale, her name synonymous with the cost of unchecked prejudice. Michelle returned to Atlanta, stepping back into her courtroom with a quiet strength that belied the storm she'd weathered. The red marks on her wrists had faded, but the memory of that day lingered, a scar she carried with pride. She'd faced the ugliness of bias head-on and emerged unbroken, her resolve sharpened by the ordeal. Daniels and Kessler began their sentences in a federal facility, their careers and reputations reduced to ash. Evelyn retreated to her mansion, her social circle shrinking as the fine drained her accounts and the headlines faded. The story rippled outward, a stark reminder to police forces nationwide. Power came with responsibility, and abusing it had a price. For Michelle, it was a victory not just personal, but a step toward the justice she'd sworn to uphold. Chief Judge Michelle Carter resumed her duties on the 11th Circuit with a quiet dignity that spoke louder than any gavel strike. The sea-tack incident hadn't diminished her, it had refined her, forging her resolve into something even stronger. She returned to her Atlanta courtroom, a wood-paneled sanctuary where she'd spent years dismantling inequity, and took her seat behind the bench. Her robe settled around her like armor, her dark eyes scanning the room with a clarity honed by experience. The ordeal at Gate C-14 lingered in her mind not as a wound, but as a badge of endurance, a testament to her refusal to bow. She'd faced the raw edge of prejudice and power abuse, and instead of breaking, she'd turned it into fuel for her lifelong mission, a justice system that stood firm for all, not just the privileged few. For Mark Daniels and Ryan Kessler, the consequences were a bitter end to their arrogance. They traded their badges for prison jumpsuits, their 4-year sentences a daily reminder of the line they'd crossed. Daniels, once a grizzled veteran, now sat in a cell, his weathered face etched with regret he couldn't voice. Kessler, the brash young officer, spent his days in silence, the weight of his actions crushing the bravado he'd once flaunted. Their names became synonymous with a cautionary tale, whispered in police locker rooms and training academies. Don't let bias blind you or it'll bury you. Evelyn Thornton, too, paid a steep price. The $500,000 fine gutted her finances, forcing her to sell off jewelry and a vacation home to cover it. She retreated from Seattle's elite circles, her once loud presence muted by shame and isolation. The woman who'd sparked the fire now lived in its ashes, a lesson in the cost of wielding privilege as a weapon. The story's echoes reached far beyond the individuals involved. News outlets dissected the trial, pundits debated the sentencing, and social media kept the conversation alive, with Durham sea-tack injustice still trending weeks later. Police departments across the country took note, some quietly revising training protocols, others issuing statements about accountability. It was a wake-up call, a stark illustration that no one was above the law, not even those sworn to enforce it. For the public, it was a moment of reckoning, a chance to confront the implicit biases that simmered beneath polite society. Michelle's ordeal wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a mirror held up to a nation, forcing it to see the cracks in its foundation. Michelle knew the fight was far from over. The incident had been a battle won, but the war against systemic inequity stretched on, a marathon she'd run since her first day as a lawyer. She returned to her work with renewed purpose, hearing cases that shaped lives and laws, her rulings a steady hand guiding the system toward fairness. Colleagues noticed a subtle shift, a fiercer edge to her questions, a deeper compassion in her decisions. She spoke at legal conferences about the experience, not as a victim but as a survivor, urging her peers to root out bias wherever it hid. Justice isn't a gift, she'd say, her voice resonant with conviction. It's a demand we must meet every day. The story of Gate C-14 lingered in the collective memory, a narrative that refused to fade. It was told and retold by passengers who'd witnessed it, by journalists who'd chronicled it, by activists who'd rallied around it. It became a touchstone, a reminder that accountability could prevail even against the odds. For Michelle, it was a chapter closed, but never forgotten, a spur to keep pushing forward. She'd faced the worst of human failings and emerged stronger, her faith in the law unshaken. The road ahead was long, littered with obstacles she'd met before and would meet again, but she'd never waver. To those who followed her journey, it was a call to action. Stand up, speak out, and hold the line. Justice, though slow, was relentless, and Michelle Carter would see it through to the end.